Hey friends, my name is Steve Guttenberg, and this continues to be the Audiophiliac Daily Show. And today is a very special episode because today it's about the words. It's about the words I use, and people, I get emails all the time asking, what does transparency mean? What does soundstage mean? So, okay, I got the message, and now I'm going to lay it all out and give you a glossary of terms. But before I get into the words themselves, I have to explain the importance of the words other than the obvious, right? And that is that they give you, the listener, cues of what to listen for. And one of my favorite words to use as an example of this is soundstage, which I believe was coined by Harry Pearson of The Absolute Sound. So before Harry came up with soundstage, there was stereo, sort of a string of instruments laid out between the left and right speakers, right? There's a trumpet, there's a tambourine, there's a saxophone, and they just were in a line between the two speakers. But Harry said, no, it's way more than just a line of instruments. It's a 3D arrangement of instruments, right? Across a sound stage. You get a feeling that some instruments are closer to you, that some are further away. There's depth. There's width even beyond the left and right speakers. There's height. There's a lot going on there that a mere line of stereo does not begin to describe. And once Harry laid that out, you know what happened? Other people, other audiophiles, heard it and said, yes, I want more of that. They wanted recordings that had it, because not all recordings are recorded well enough to actually have a soundstage. That's another story. But once Harry pointed it out, well, people wanted recordings that had good soundstage. They wanted speakers that could play back a full-blown soundstage. And they never thought about that before until Harry pointed it out. So once you really start to get a grip on these words and understand why I'm using them, you will be a better listener and you will get more out of these reviews and other people's reviews that use these words. Let's start with audiophile. That makes sense, right? Who is an audiophile? An audiophile is a person who cares about the sound of recorded music and live music as well. But the music that they control at home or on the go, if they care about the sound of their music, in my book, they are an audiophile. The price of your system, of your gear, doesn't qualify you or disqualify you from the club, so to speak, right? As long as you can listen attentively from time to time, that is, not be multitasking when you listen, not all the time, but some of the time, you're an audiophile, definitely. So we got that's probably the hardest one. Really, is this whole who is an audiophile and what is an audiophile? An audiophile is a person who listens attentively, who cares about the sound of music. So we will then leap to accuracy. What is accuracy? Accuracy is simply that the output of the speaker in some way resembles the input to the source. You know, the signal going in and the signal coming out are closely related. The more closely related they are, the more accurate they are. That in and of itself is not an indication of quality, but it is an aspect of it. Some audiophiles like to throw around the word analytical, meaning clinical, hyper detailed, maybe like even too much information, overly detailed. Now, some people want that. Some people cannot get enough detail, resolution, clarity, etc., and they may be going to a system that others might find analytical. In other words, revealing of all the flaws in the recording itself. That would be an overly analytical system. Then comes Boxy. Now, Boxy, I think it's sort of fallen out of favor, but Boxy means that the speakers sound like boxes. They have a sound like that. They sound closed in. They sound like the music is struggling to get out of the box. That's what Boxy sound refers to. Clean. Now, clean is a word I use a lot. Clean refers to low in distortion, very clear, very open sounding. In other words, again, the sound isn't coming from a box. But basically, clean refers to a low distortion sound. Distortion could be coming from the speaker or the electronics or the source. The sound has to start clean in the recording itself, and then in the electronics being used to play the recording, and then in the speaker. If it starts out clean and it comes out clean at the other end through the speakers or headphones, you are listening to clean sound. Then we come to dark. So dark is the opposite. Dark is lacking in detail and treble energy, and lack of dynamic oomph. It sounds sort of held back, hooded even. That's what dark means to us audiophiles. Definition. That definition is usually attached to bass, as in bass definition, meaning you can hear clearly every note, the pitch of every note. Now that's really difficult to achieve. That takes quite a system and quite a speaker or subwoofer to do that with all types of music. But that's what we're shooting for, is definition, where there's clarity of each note. Depth. Now depth is usually a part of soundstage, as in soundstage depth, the imaging between the speakers. That's another word we'll cover soon. Imaging, soundstage. But soundstage depth means essentially that the sound is coming from behind the plane of the stereo speakers, so from behind the speakers. Again, this is a tough one to achieve well. You have to have a really well set up system, and your speakers cannot be close to a wall. Anytime the speakers are near a wall, there's not, well, I guess by definition, you will not hear any depth or soundstage depth if the speakers are jammed up against the wall. This isn't easy to achieve, this soundstage depth ideal. Even if your speakers are a distance from the wall, not all speakers are capable of it. A lot of recordings don't have any soundstage depth, so it can be elusive. It's hard to achieve, but when you get there, you'll be, yes, it's a thrill. The first time you hear it in your system, soundstage depth, you'll be one happy audiophile. Detail, well, you know what that is, right? Detail is detail. When you hear fine levels of clarity, distinction of notes, of the singer's breath, all of that those are examples of detail. Again, it has to be in the recording for you to hear it, but if it's there and you're crossing that boundary and you're hearing more of it, more detail, that's your goal. That's it. You've achieved it. Bingo. Here's an audio word that has existed long before there were audiophiles, and it is distortion. Any change to the original signal is, in the audiophile world, distortion. So what comes in, the input signal versus the output signal, any change to it is distorted. But distortion can sound like a coarsening, a harshness to the sound, graininess, a veiling, all sorts of subtractive distortions, that are additive distortions. Changes that weren't there to the original signal are now superimposed over the sound, and it adds these distortions, things that most people don't want their sound to be. Now, of course, if the music itself was intentionally distorted, as in like guitar feedback and distortion, well, yeah, that's the good kind of distortion. But in the audio world, most audiophiles would want to have lower and lower levels of distortion in their system so they could hear the sound with greater, well, clarity, a lack of distortion. Let's try dry. You know what dry means? Dry means not wet. So there was this Chesky session years and years and years ago, and in between takes, David Chesky, the producer of the session, said to me as we were about to do another take, or as the band was about to do another take, he said, "Listen for wetness." And one of the musicians in the room was struck by that. Wetness? What is wetness? Wetness means the opposite of dry, the sound of the room. Is it overly reverberant? Is it too wet? So the opposite of that is dry. And dry means a lack of reverberation, a lack of the sound of the room or space that the music is being performed in. That is dry sound. So next up comes dynamics. It's one of my favorites, and I use that word a lot, probably too much, but basically dynamics means the abrupt change in level from, let's say, soft to loud. Is that being preserved? Now, of course, it has to be, like I've said many times already today, it has to be in the recording itself. The hi-fi system, the audio system, doesn't create dynamics. It can only play the dynamics that are in the recording. So if the recording has dynamics, those soft to loud changes, or a whisper to a scream from very, very soft to very, very loud, very, very quickly, those are dynamics. A whack on a drum, it doesn't have to just be low frequencies. It can be the mid-range, a vocalist. It can be the crash of a cymbal, the sudden change of loudness, of volume, is what dynamics are all about. And that's one of the things in real life, music that isn't being amplified especially, you're so aware of hearing dynamics, and it isn't just, I shouldn't just limit it to the extremes of very soft to very loud. It can be relatively small changes in loudness are still considered dynamics. Effortless. Now, I use that word a lot. I'm guilty of that. And by effortless, I mean that there's no strain in the sound. It's not like you're hearing creeping distortion as it's getting louder and louder. That would be the opposite of effortless. That would be strained, right? So effortless just means the sound, the system has no limits to how loud it could get at any given time. That would be effortless. What about fast? I know some of you are saying, Steve, what does fast mean? Good question. It's the opposite of slow. A slow system would sound sluggish, kind of lackluster, just kind of blah, right? But fast means listening to the cymbals, the rivets on the cymbal. You hear every little rivet vibrate when the drummer hits the cymbal. That's fast. And a slow sounding system would make all that detail just disappear into a blur and just sort of blahs. Sort of a blah sound is the opposite of fast. Fat. Well, fat, well, now we're in the basic, we're down in the basic end. Now, what about fat? Fat, you know what fat is? Fat is the opposite of thin. No, in this case, no. Fat is usually about bass. Is the bass pronounced? Is it big and meaty and fat? That big, bold sound. Sometimes fat can be a negative, like it's too fat, it's too bloated, it's too thick. That's beyond fat. That's just bad. That's just bad bass. Now, of course, especially when it comes to bass, that is definitely a matter of taste. Some people want their bass to be big and fat and meaty, over the top, too much bass, fat bass. So fat for one person could be just right, For somebody else it could be, that's over the top bass. Forward. Now, forward means that the sound appears closer. And it could be mid-range. It usually is mid-range, but it can be treble, it can be bass, but usually we're talking about mid-range, a forward sound where, like horn speakers are said to be forward. Even good ones, like klipsches. Some of my favorite klipsches have a forward, very immediate presentation, where if you went from a forward-sounding speaker to a more neutral-sounding speaker, the sound would appear to recede by comparison. Then there's harsh. You know what harsh is, right? Harsh basically means unpleasant sound, unmusical sound, aggressive sound. You want to turn it down. It's so annoyingly harsh. Imaging, well, it's a big one, right? I use this word all the time, imaging. So there's the left speaker and the right speaker, and you're hear the sound all between them, right? That's what imaging is. The sound is just coming from the left and right, but there's the sound that appears to come from in between and even outside the edges of the speaker. That's what imaging is. Now, there's a word coming up, soundstage, which is sort of about imaging, but in a more specific way. But an image is basically the sound created by a pair of speakers, or it could be in a multi-channel system. Some of my monophile friends can hear imaging that's in a mono recording just in terms of its depth, its front to back depth. That's an imaging of a sort. Muddy. Now, muddy usually refers to bass, as in sloppy bass, thick, bloated, indistinct, low definition bass is muddy bass. Palpable. I didn't used to use that word a lot in these reviews, and that's been creeping in lately. Now, palpable is sort of a reach out and touch phenomenon, right? You can reach out and there it is. It's like right there. You know, it's like if you ever been in a jazz club, right? And you were sitting just like in the first group of tables near the band, right? And there's a musician playing a saxophone, right? You close your eyes, you feel like you can just reach out and there is the sax, right? Or there are the drums, right? Or there's somebody over there playing a tambourine. It's there, it's palpable. You can, if it was in real life, you could reach out and touch it. I don't know how happy they'd be about you touching their instrument, but you could, right? And when you're listening to a system that has this quality, this palpable quality, of course it has to be in the recording, and you feel like you could reach out and touch it, that's what a palpable sound is. Then there's rhythm and pace. Now that's a British term, and it refers to people just getting it physically engaged by the music, right? You just want to move to it. You want to tap your foot and move in your chair and bop your head. That's rhythm and pace, as opposed to sitting there like a lump and not feeling anything from the music physically. But it engages you in that way. It makes you want to move. That's rhythm and pace. Now, soundstage is related to imaging, but soundstage is a more defined way of describing it, where within this soundstage you can pick out individual instruments and basically you hear, well, the spaces between the instruments. That's what's so important about this, right? So there's depth, there's width, there's even height in a good soundstage, but soundstage focus lets you hear individual musicians or singers within that soundstage. And when that happens, wow, is that fantastic. I hear that a lot on Duke Ellington recordings that he did for Columbia in the 60s at the 30th Street Church. There's a whole story about that, but they took this church, they made it into a recording studio. And it's a big room, and they could, space people out more than they could in a crowded recording studio, and you just hear them within the church, right? You can hear not just the individual musicians, but you can hear the room itself. That is, you hear that in a soundstage. It is goosebumps city. Tight bass. Well, it's the opposite of muddy and bloated and thick. Very clearly defined, pitch-defined bass. Like you can hear every note. It's not just like this thud, thud, thud sound, but a specific note pitch that you're hearing with each bass note. And sometimes you can pick out the bass drum and the bass instrument from each other. Sometimes they kind of blur together. That's not uncommon. But when you can hear that really, really well, that's what pitch definition, bass definition is all about. Tone. Now, tonality means, do instruments sound like themselves? And when you listen to acoustic bass, does it sound like a big wooden instrument that's making the air move, right? When you listen to brass instruments, you have that metallic, brassy sound. And cymbals, you hear that metallic quality, that sort of thing, right? So when you hear instruments, when you hear a system that does tone really well, the payoff is hearing things sound like they really do. Because some systems that don't have great tone may be doing many other things well, but they sort of sound fake, phony. They do not sound, they don't cross over that boundary towards real because they don't have good tone. Transparency. Now, transparency is a biggie, one that I use a lot of reviewers use, a lot of audiophiles word. Transparency. Now, that's another big one, really, really big one, because it's about hearing through all of this stuff, your system, etc. You're hearing back through time to the recording session itself. It's not literal that you can do that, but that you get closer and closer to feeling like all the equipment used to make the recording and to press onto disk of some form or make a file of it, and then coming through your system, all the electronics, all the wires, all that stuff into a vibrating cone or planner, and you're hearing music. All of that has disappeared, and you're hearing just the music. That's what transparency is and means. It's a journey. It's something you're moving towards getting that totally transparent sound. Not easy to achieve, not at all. Very, very difficult to achieve. So it's a matter of getting more and more transparent, hopefully, or not, as opposed to less and less transparent. You want more, not less, usually. So there you have it, my friends. Those are the words. Those are the words. Those are my tools when I'm describing sound with words. I do the best I can. My name is Steve Guttenberg. This continues to be the Audiophiliac Daily Show. If you dig it, please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Help us get to 150,000 by late October, early November. 150,000 subscribers strong worldwide. It's a worldwide community, the Audiophiliac Daily Show is. So thank you guys for being there. Beyond subscribing, here's what you can do. Check out the Patreon, which can be found at patreon.com/audiophiliac. And I will link to that below. But beyond that, well, I'm just going to thank you for being there day after day after day, year after year. This is the 3rd year of the Audiophiliac Daily Show. So thanks for being here, and I hope to see you back here again very, very soon. Bye-bye.